Part 8, The Return of Law and Order and the Edict of Horemheb. We last left off with Egypt in absolute shambles after the pharaoh tried to change the religion, his child son took over and then died, the child son's wife offered the throne of Egypt to a foreign king, only for an old vizier to thwart the conspiracy, marry the royal woman, and somehow manage to keep the whole country from falling completely apart. The old man's successor was Horemheb, the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, unbroken from Amo some 250 years earlier. Horemheb, by profession, was a military man, probably starting his career under Akhenaten and then rising to prominence under King Tut. He married Ai's daughter, Mutnemejet, a name Bob Breyer translates as Sweet Mama, which is pretty funny. It's a tenuous connection to the royal house of Amos, but it's still a connection that's able to legitimize Horemheb. Akhenaten's religious shift disrupted life in a very plain way, since he was neglecting the military and also government administration. His administrators and tax collectors were essentially allowed to run rampant through the country and do as they pleased, while the king was suntanning in the name of Jesus. Akhenaten's religious shift must have impacted the legal system in a more nuanced way, though. I couldn't find anybody who specifically researched or discussed this issue, so I'm going to give my thoughts. Since judges were the priests of Mot, and administrators only a few generations earlier, like Rekhmire, had striven to fulfill Mot's principles, what happened when Mot was declared an inferior god, or later on, and after Akhenaten's 9th year, no longer recognized? Did those principles go away? Were they usurped by those of the Aten? I think that the answer is an unequivocal yes. Fairness and justice didn't die because they're common sense principles, but the weightiness of Mot, fairness, truth, and justice as a religious imperative must have weakened. The whole point of Mot was to act fairly and justly so that you would gain access to the afterlife. Atenism, from what I could tell, doesn't have an afterlife. It's more of a universal consciousness thing. Without an afterlife, what's the end goal? Is it worth being fair if it doesn't get you anything? So yes, laxity and administrative oversight is probably the most obvious cause of the looting, but I think there's also a religious shift as well, where maybe these administrators weren't fearing eternal damnation and being driven out of existence. But it's not just that the priests of Mot were eliminated. In fact, the entire priesthood was pretty much eliminated or driven underground. The temple property of other gods, which consisted of large, vast endowments of land, gold, wheat, etc., was all confiscated by the Aten cult. The temples were super rich places, so the transfer of wealth that took place during the reign of Akhenaten was certainly sudden and certainly massive, and it definitely wasn't properly managed, which resulted in just grievous corruption and bribery. This is what Horemheb walked into, willingly or otherwise. He needed to restore the priesthood, which he said he did by re-endowing the old gods' temples, and then he needed to restore the divine order with a special eye to rooting out corruption in government. The vehicle he decided to use to achieve his goals was a novel one, not yet seen in Egypt's 2,000-year existence. Written edicts, the closest thing that we have to a set of laws in ancient Egypt so far. Each section of the edict goes something like this. Horemheb expresses displeasure about a problem afflicting the land, and then there's the hypothetical commission of an offense by some unnamed person, so like an example case. And then Horemheb punishes the hypothetical offender. He probably could have written it in if-then form, but I have a feeling that there really wasn't much precedent for what he was doing, so he was just kind of winging it. The first section of Horemheb's edict pertains to government officials seizing grain or the transport vessels carrying goods intended for kitchens or breweries under the guise of a tax. He decreed that any officer who seizes the dues, they're not collecting taxes. They're essentially saying, hey, we're here to collect tax, and they're stealing in the process. And anybody who acted in that way, at least in terms of a kitchen or a brewery, would have their nose cut off. That was their punishment. In other law codes we have from Mesopotamia, namely Hammurabi's, chopping off body parts was common. You know the common trope, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, blah, 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 blah. Hammurabi's code was about 400 years older than Horemheb's reign, and the Babylonian dynasty which ruled at the time of Horemheb was the Kassite Babylonian dynasty. Hammurabi was an Amorite. There's likely no connections there. But the Middle Assyrian law codes that were in effect at the time of Horemheb did have chopping off the nose as a punishment, specifically intended to mark evildoers. Horemheb, I will note, he was a military man. He was campaigning in Canaan and on the borders of Mesopotamia. I can't prove this in any way, but it's possible that he came into contact with the Assyrian custom of cutting off people's noses while on campaign. The second section of the Edict of Horemheb pertains to robbing the poor of wood. Egypt doesn't have wood. There's the Nile, and there's reeds, and there's grain, and then on each side of the river there's these bluffs that have desert on top of them extending for miles. So all of the wood, or nearly all of the wood, was imported from Lebanon and Canaan. Unfortunately, this is fragmentary. No punishments are provided. I imagine it's something similar to the cutting off of the nose. The third section concerns that of a man who turns up who has been robbed. So we have here a merchant coming from another land or perhaps traveling within Egypt who has been robbed by bandits. And when he goes to customs, the government officials are essentially taking the clothes off his back. He already lost his good to the robbers, but the custom officials are taxing him anyway based on the goods that he should have been carrying. In those cases where you have a robbed person, government officials are not to tax the robbed individual because Horemheb notes that that person has nothing, and to tax that person would be a great injustice. If the customs official did decide to levy a tax on the victim of the robbery, the official would have to pay him restitution, giving him the things back. The fourth section concerns officials who rob the poor of dues for the harem, or soldiers who rob the dues for the gods. Any officer found to have committed extortion or theft for these purposes would have their nose cut off and would be sent to a place called Tharu. Tharu was a border fortress leading out of Egypt into Canaan. Now, remember that at this time, Egypt is at war with the Hittites, and Canaan is a total disaster because of the Akhenaten and the later Zenanza affair. Being shipped to a border fortress was essentially the equivalent of being shipped to the Eastern Front as a German during World War II. It was not an ideal post. The fifth section of Horemheb's edict concerns the unlawful appropriation of slave service. It was apparently an issue during the time of Akhenaten and King Tut that when tax collectors collected taxes in the form of a specific plant called the Katha plant, they would commandeer the local servants and slaves to collect some of the plant for their own pockets, and sometimes these abuses lasted for weeks at a time. Those tax collectors found guilty of this offense would be forced to farm the Katha plant themselves as forced laborers for the same period of time that the tax collector confiscated the slaves or the servants. The sixth section of the edict has to do with theft by soldiers of animal hides. Now, obviously, animal hides are important for a number of reasons and uses in ancient Egypt, mainly for clothing and armor. They were also used for chariots, by the way, because you would use woven hides to kind of give you a bouncy platform, so you're not bouncing all over the place on the chariot. These hides were normally collected via taxation. We discussed taxation previously. You would essentially kick up a percentage of your goods to the vizier, who would then kick up to the pharaoh. Those hides which were taxable were branded. By Horemheb's time, it looks as if the soldiers were just roaming the land, taking all of the animal hides that they could find, branded or appropriated for taxation or otherwise. In those cases, again, the soldiers' noses would be cut off, and they would be sent to the border fortress of Pharaoh to meet a surely imminent death. This section of the edict also contains a subsection, which is unique to this section and this section only. It has to deal with tax collectors and loan herds, flocks of cattle loaned by the pharaoh to private persons. This appears to have been a thing, so if you didn't own the cattle outright, the pharaoh would essentially loan you cattle that you could, reproduce and then give the fruits of that back to the state. If the contracted cattle died, then the tax collectors are compelled by the edict to produce the hides to the pharaoh's inspectors. If they fail to do so, which implies that they stole the hide from the deceased animal prior to the inspectors being able to get there, they had overseers, so there was some sort of administrative accountability. Then the offender is to be beaten with 100 blows and be given 5 wounds, which I'm interpreting to be cuts, as well as having to give back the hides. The 7th section of the edict pertains to dishonest inspectors colluding with thieving tax collectors. So again, we have these inspectors who oversee the tax collectors, and sometimes the inspectors themselves weren't honest. Apparently, it wasn't enough that the tax collectors had sticky hands, because the government inspectors apparently had some too. The law is fragmentary, but it contains a specific incident that also took place during the reign of Thutmose III. The punishment is lost. We don't have it. The 8th section warns against the extortion of theft of vegetables under the guise of taxation, similar to that of the kitchen and the breweries. Anyone using the color of the pharaoh's taxation authorities to steal veggies would be punished, and it's probably the same thing, probably the cutting off of the nose and sending to Thoru. The edict then breaks into another section, this one narrating the king's reforms and setting the stage for reform of the courts themselves, and it's very instructive. It starts by talking about how Horemheb has sought officials who were excellent in speech and know how to judge the innermost heart to act as judges of the great hall. He says that he appointed 2 individuals, one in the north and one in the south, who would act not as viziers, but as dedicated judges, an actual judiciary, something that we haven't seen before. He goes on to say that every man in the judge's land seeking redress will come to him, and he references publishing a series of regulations, which are now lost to us, unfortunately, and posting them up in the courts, instructing the judges on how to do their jobs. He then gets to the point. He abolishes taxes for this new class of judges, saying that a judge cannot judge others if they accept bribes. So to deter bribery, he exempts the judiciary. The thought being that, okay, if you keep more of your salary, you're not gonna be vulnerable to accepting bribes. For any member of the judiciary who chose to accept a bribe anyway, they would be put to death. This is the only mention of the death penalty in the edict. Frankly, I'm not sure how this works, because Horemheb also sets up lower courts. And he mentions that those lower courts are made up primarily of priests. I can't tell if the priests who sit in the lower courts were also exempted from taxation per the edict, because the church had their own tax system. Then it starts to get a little bit confusing. He doesn't flesh it out in any detail, so I'm inclined to think that it only applies to those 2 judges, the one in the north and one in the south. That is the end of the Edict of Horemheb. That's the closest thing we have to any sort of written law in ancient Egypt until the Iron Age. But it's not the end of our legal analysis. We still have 100 or so years before the Sea People show up, and another 100 years before things get really bad. When we pick up again, we're going to be talking about the Ramessid dynasty, myths, bad wives, litigious villages, and the beginning of the fading of Ma'at. Thank you for watching.